Julian Assange, thanks so much for joining us on Triple J's Hack program.
You're welcome.
Julian, you've been holed up in the Ecuadorian embassy now for over 1 year. Before we get into politics, how are you faring on a personal level?
Oh, all right. I mean, I've sort of developed a routine to deal with the situation. It's been 3 years now between solitary confinement, house arrest, and political asylum here in the embassy. Other people, arguably, are in more difficult situations, and I think, I developed a habit of, when in a difficult situation, just throwing myself into work, and that's working so far.
What is that routine that you've developed?
Well, it's a routine of focusing the mind on things that are more important than your own situation.
Julian, if you were elected to the Victorian Senate, as you're trying to be, what kind of senator would you be? Because the issues that you care about, like transparency and corruption, come up so rarely. Often you'll be voting on taxes, health-related issues, education. How can Australians know how you'll vote on those sorts of bread and butter issues?
Yeah, well, some of those we speak about directly, but issues as to governance, transparent, accountable, just governance, affect every single issue. I would never bother to create a party that would just go into the Senate to push one position or another on a few issues. The whole idea is to go into the Senate and hold the Senate to account and to scrutinise it in the way that we've become famous for in scrutinising the Pentagon or big bank corruption in other countries.
So how do you expect to apply those values that you hold so closely to those sorts of bread and butter issues like education or taxes?
Well, first of all, the WikiLeaks party and me as a senator, we're not going into government. People should vote differently in the Senate to how they do in the House of Reps. That's the only smart way to vote, is to put a different party that is not in the House of Representatives to scrutinise the behaviour of the parties in the House of Reps who are. And those are the parties that form government. They have various policies. They have some degree of mandate for those policies. And our task is to make sure that those policies are not corrupted, that they're implemented efficiently, that the Australian public is aware as soon as possible. Now, we do have a little bit of a degree to influence legislation and certainly to perhaps to block it in the Senate. And the principles that we will take doing that are to make sure that there is proper transparency in the process so Australians know exactly what is going on, and that there is proper transparency in the implementation of these programs, that there's no cronyism that's going on. We all know that in Australia that there's two basic problems with Australian politics. The first is the corrupting influence of big business on Australian politics. People like Bob Carr, unelected senator, formerly with Macquarie Bank. We all know that he'll go into Macquarie Bank when he comes out of the election. The other part is secret deals with extended networks. In these two areas, it is secrecy that is the problem.
Julian, you're asking Victorians to vote you personally into the Senate, but how do you expect to be actually physically sworn in when you're stuck in the Ecuadorian embassy in London?
I have up until September 2014 to return to Australia. If I am not able to return, then one of my running mates can take my place. I've said that will be Leslie Carnold, well-regarded ethicist in Victoria. But something very interesting is happening here in the UK, which is the abuses in my extradition case, namely being extradited without charge in any country. Those have led to a reform effort by the British government, and beginning of 2014, they are pulling out of the Extradition Act and modifying it so those abuses can't occur. So hopefully that would see me free to return to Australia in relation to the Swedish extradition case. Now, the US case is a much more serious issue, and the DOJ, Department of Justice in the United States, has been aggressively pursuing that. There is no public extradition request yet in the US, but there may be a secret one. So that's something that has to be dealt with our lawyers and in negotiations between the Ecuadorian government and the UK government.
Julian, as you vie for a Senate seat in the upcoming election, what do you say to those Australians who are suspicious that you're just doing it to save yourself from your legal predicament?
Well, I said that I would be running for this Senate long before coming here to the Ecuadorian embassy and receiving political asylum from the Ecuadorian government. But we have a whole party. I'm quite proud of the team that we've put together, highly educated people with a long record of fighting for justice for Australians, not part of any cronyistic group like the ALP or the Liberal Party or even arguably the Greens now.
But that team only came together this year. The warrant for your arrest came out at the end of 2010. Can you understand that people might be a bit cynical about that?
I don't think people should be cynical about it. They should understand that I have a long history of fighting for these things in many different domains. Are you suggesting that I started WikiLeaks because there was a warrant for my arrest? Of course not. What I'm interested and concerned about is well documented, and I fought hard for it.
But do you think if you were in the Australian Senate, it would help your situation potentially with the US or with the Swedish authorities?
Look, I personally, if I was an Australian, I would be quite pleased about giving the finger to the US and UK in this matter by voting for me. I think they need a bit of discipline in relation to how they're pushing Australians around and pushing the Australian government around. And the Australian Labor Party, the Conservatives are just as bad, but we most recently had the Australian Labor Party in government. It needs a very strong signal that it is not acceptable for it to behave in such a way to an Australian publisher. The Australian government has fed information to the United States on WikiLeaks and on me. That is not acceptable. They don't represent Australian people. There's a corruption of purpose. They represent other interests. They represent the interests of their big business pals. They represent the interests of the US Embassy that they keep going to the cocktail parties of in Canberra. They represent the interests of their extended overseas networks that they gradually build up while they're in Canberra.
So no cocktails for you?
Yeah, I'm afraid not.
Over the weekend, the WikiLeaks party did cause quite a stir with their preference decisions. They put a number of right-wing parties ahead of the Greens in 3 states where they've got Senate candidates. Now, it really got up the nose of the Greens and confused some people about where WikiLeaks actually stand. In a minute, we'll hear from the Greens WA Senator Scott Ludlam on this by WikiLeaks. Now, while Greens preferences will flow to WikiLeaks before any party, the Western Australian Green Senator Scott Ludlam is down below his closest rival, David Wirapunda, who's standing for the Nationals. Now, Scott Ludlam's been one of the biggest supporters of WikiLeaks. In June this year, he put up a bill into Parliament called Get a Warrant, aimed at reducing surveillance on members of the Australian public, so very much in line with WikiLeaks thinking. I spoke to Scott Ludlam just a moment ago to find out how he felt about being preferenced below the Nationals.
Because we've been under really sustained attack, really from both of the old parties in this election, it's going to come right down to the wire in Western Australia. And I think it means it's likely that we will be contesting the seat with the Nationals. After
all you've done for the WikiLeaks cause, you've brought up Julian Assange's personal situation in Parliament. How does it feel not to be preferenced higher than your main rival?
Oh, I think it's mystifying. It's extremely disappointing, and it's disappointed a lot of their supporters. I think a lot of them have no idea why the party has done what it's done. I don't think it advances Julian's cause at all, to be quite honest.
You're listening to Hack with Tom Tilley.
So why did WikiLeaks preference far-right parties and competitors to the Greens above them? Well, I asked Julian Assange directly.
This is a complex issue. There was a decision that preferences would be done by the states, by the candidates in the states. There are 2 different issues here, New South Wales versus WA. In WA, there's no decision to preference the National Scott Ludlam. There was a decision to preference a new entrant into the WA political field, an Australian Aboriginal who happens to be a member of the National Party, and to symbolically, display him in the preference list. The analysis is that he had no chance of winning. So he's in place there as a symbolic gesture to him. But the Nationals are not part of the coalition in WA, and they are a minor party. As far as Scott Ludlam is concerned, well, I'm personal friends with Scott Ludlam and very appreciative of the work Scott has done. Where possible, where we see shining stars in individual parties, like Scott or this guy from the Nats, we should individually preference them highly. Now, in relation to New South Wales, I'm told by the people in New South Wales that that's an administrative error. There's only 2 parties at issue. One is the Shooters and the other is Australia First. They are preferenced before the Greens, but they're not highly preferenced. And that's been looked at as to exactly what's going on. What happened in WA was not a mistake. It was a reflection of my mandate to WA that Scott Ludham, as an individual, to be preferenced highly. But
you've still put him below his biggest rival.
But minors who didn't have a chance of getting elected could be put in front of him, which is normally what is done.
But that's not exactly true. You've put the Nationals above him, and that's his biggest rival.
No, that's not true. My advice is that, in fact, the Nationals in WA last election got 3-point-something%.
Just lastly on the preferences, you've talked there about Western Australia and New South Wales, but even in Victoria, your state, where you're the lead candidate, the Greens are at 24th on the list. Why did that happen when they have been your biggest supporters in Parliament?
Well, WikiLeaks is not a party of the right. It's not a party of the left. We're a party of justice and transparency and accountability that falls across party lines.
Triple J Hack with Tom Tilley.
WikiLeaks founder and editor-in-chief and Victorian Senate candidate Julian Assange. Few people texting in. Julian has my vote. He's so real, unlike others. Another person says, I don't want to be represented by a man who won't face up to rape allegations. Another person says, I applaud Julian for distancing himself from the Greens. Maybe Julian has realised that the Greens' policies, aside from the ones that look after the environment, are quite extreme and detrimental to our country. Brad's called in from Melbourne. Brad, you support WikiLeaks, but you're not too happy about the way they've preferenced the Greens.
Oh, look, I support them more generally. I won't be voting for them. I will be voting for the Greens. I support them on transparency and accountability, and because of that, I think they'd be a welcome addition to the Senate. But I can't believe the way they've treated the Greens, especially after all the support they've received.
Thanks for the call, Brad. Still a few people texting, and I think this preference action by WikiLeaks and Assange by extension shows he either can't be trusted or is politically naive. That's Tia from Sydney. Keep your texts coming in. Loving to hear your reactions to this interview. 0439 75 7555. That's 0439 75 7555. Now, as you've been hearing, the WikiLeaks party are running Senate candidates in Western Australia, New South Wales, and of course Victoria, where Julian Assange is the lead candidate. To find out what Julian Assange's chances of actually getting in are, I spoke to the ABC's election analyst, Anthony Green.
I don't think so. I don't think they'll get enough first preferences. They'll have troubles being spotted on the ballot paper by most voters, even if they're looking for them, given the size of the ballot papers. And I realistically can't see him getting enough percentage vote to stay ahead of other minor parties in the Victorian ballot paper.
You don't think, given his notoriety, that people will look for him on that ballot paper?
No, I don't. I mean, unless you staff polling places and hand out how-to-vote cards, you're not going to get above 2 or 3% of the vote, or unless you've got a really strong network, email network of the type. I'm just not convinced that he has enough support for people who know he's going to be there and they need to look for him.
How close will he come, and what would he need to actually get a Senate seat?
Well, the quota is 14.3%, and I can't see him getting anything above 4% at most. There's some strange outside possibility he could take a seat from the Greens, but I think it's unlikely. I just don't think he's going to get enough first preference votes to stay in the mix long enough to benefit from preferences from other parties.
Hack with Tom Tilley.
So there you have it. According to Anthony Green, ABC's election analyst, Julian Assange's chances are not looking good. It turns out, funnily enough, that Julian Assange is looking at very different numbers and is a lot more hopeful.
Statistical polling, even done by the Australian Labor Party's own polling outfit, UMR, and the voting intention is between 25 and 28% of the population, 26 according to Ray Morgan in Victoria. Now, if we get above 4%, that's quite helpful for the longevity of the Australian WikiLeaks party because it means that we get paid back administrative fees for running the party between now and the next election. So there's a lot of types of victories that can be had, getting things onto the agenda, getting above 4%, getting people into the Senate, and developing an extended network of volunteers who can fight for the things that we believe to be important.
Julian Assange there, one person's texted in saying the WikiLeaks party is not one man. It's a platform built around transparency. Don't make it about the man like Manning Snowden. It's about the Australian people. Another person says, Assange would be an awesome senator. We need him back here. This guy is a showboating moron and a con. Go WikiLeaks. Australia has been ruled by the rich elite for too long. This is a chance for real truth. Well, there you have it. So you can text in 0439 75 7555. Now, it's not just the Australian election that makes this a particularly interesting time for Julian Assange. The Obama administration has proposed changes to the way America's National Security Agency is monitored, and some believe that's a result of Edward Snowden's revelations. Now, also this week, actually, the Guardian journalist who was reporting Edward Snowden's story, Glenn Greenwald, had his boyfriend detained at Heathrow Airport under anti-terror legislation. And also this week, any day now, Bradley Manning's sentence will be handed down, and prosecutors are demanding the 25-year-old spend at least 60 years in prison. Now, in the sentencing hearing for the convictions of espionage last week, Bradley Manning actually apologised. He said he was misguided to think that he could change the world by leaking, and that he should have tried to effect change from the inside. His family also gave testimony about his difficult upbringing, and I asked Julian Assange how Manning's apology and the espionage convictions make him feel about potentially facing a US court.
Hack.
This is a situation where a young man has been kept in prison for the longest of any US military pretrial detainee, over 3 years without trial, where he was facing over 90 years imprisonment. So I assume his lawyers advised him to do what lawyers always advise you to do, which is to demonstrate contrition to the court, to bow down before it, to reduce your sentence. He has 90 years to play for. I think that was probably a wise tactical manoeuvre. In his statement saying that how could he think that he could change the world? You'll notice there was no statement saying that he didn't.
The Washington Post reported after Manning was found guilty of espionage that prosecuting you now as a co-conspirator is even more likely. Is that how you see it?
It's how the US lawyers see it, although our calculus has not changed much. We've been aware of the situation for a long time. It's one of the interesting aspects of Australian politics that Foreign Minister Bob Carr has been continually repeating lies about this subject that have been coordinated with the US ambassador. It was very clear when the Swedish Foreign Minister came over that tri-party coordination on statements. The subject of the US grand jury against Bradley Manning, against WikiLeaks and me, was a front-page article in the New York Times back in June. In the United States, there's no debate. The advice from my US lawyers in Washington is that an indictment has already been filed. Other leaks have come out from organisations like Stratfor saying that is the case.
And do you think the findings in the court-martial on Bradley Manning's case affect that negatively or positively for your potential situation?
It doesn't change our calculus because we're across this situation. It's new. It's some news perhaps to the Australian public, but it's not really news in the United States. It's quite an interesting political decision in the Bradley Manning case. Look, in the opener, the prosecution repeatedly mentioned me, mentioned WikiLeaks, etc. But there was no legal need to do that. That is a political decision.
Does the fact that he wasn't convicted of aiding the enemy give you some hope of softer treatment if you were to end up in front of a grand jury?
We lobbied hard that aiding the enemy, which was a life sentence, be knocked out. Look, Bradley Manning was convicted of 5 charges of espionage. That's a disgrace. This is not a coincidence. It is part of a decision by the Obama administration that it is going to criminalise national security journalism. It is part of the Obama administration's war on journalism.
Well, speaking of Barack Obama and his administration, the week before last, he actually proposed changes that would overhaul the National Security Agency's surveillance programs. Now, Obama's office acknowledged that Edward Snowden's actions had sparked a much more rapid policy debate. But do you think it actually sparked the whole rethink?
Barack Obama was forced into a position where he had to say that there would be some kind of change, some kind of review. It's good that he was forced into that position, but the review that he announced, it's going to be a whitewash.
But was it a small victory for you?
It is a victory to have pushed the debate so clear into the public eye that the president is forced to respond in that way. Now, of course, what is necessary is to push it even further. So this is not just a matter of shoving something off to an inquiry where it can be buried. Big news this morning is that Glenn Greenwald, he's that friend of mine and a journalist that's been involved in the big National Security Agency story with Edward Snowden. Well, his partner was just flying back from Berlin to Rio through London, was just detained yesterday under counter-terrorism legislation, held for 9 hours in the airport, interrogated, and all his materials taken from him. So that's an example of the UK state at work. When you're involved in this business, legal systems become compromised because of the degree of political pressure.
Julian Assange, what would it take for you to go to Sweden for questioning over the sexual assault allegations? What safeguards would it take for you to do that?
Look, the real question is what would it take to make the Swedes behave and send people to the UK when it wants to ask some questions? In fact, what would it take for Sweden to behave like it does in other cases and send people to the UK when it wants to ask questions or pick up the telephone? We have said that I will go to Sweden if they guarantee that I'm not re-extradited to the US. They refuse. We have asked the UK to insist that Sweden does not re-extradite me. And the UK has refused. The Ecuadorian state has formally made those diplomatic representations asking that. Sweden and the UK refuse. The Australian government under Bob Carr has refused to even ask that. It is an abuse to hold someone for 3 years and try and extradite them without charge and apply rules to their case which are applied to no other case.
You've been very public in your disappointment with the Foreign Minister Bob Carr's level of assistance to you. Would you feel better if Julie Bishop was the Foreign Minister?
No, in fact, Brandis has been one of the most vocal opponents of WikiLeaks. He would become the Attorney General. We don't expect any better treatment under the coalition whatsoever. Both parties are united in their agreement, which means do whatever the US wants, whenever the US wants it. There's no difference.
Julian Assange, I will end it very soon. I'll ask you one more question. What do you miss most about not being able to be in Australia?
My family, obviously, which this situation has been quite hard on. They've had to change their names. They've had to move locations. There has been threats made in the United States that the way to get at me is to kill off my family members. But moving beyond that, well, the directness of Australians is so much more easy to deal with than the class-ridden London establishment. The colour of the sky, the open horizon, the beach, the wildlife, the sounds of the birds. So, yeah, I miss a lot. I grew up in the bush in many different places in Australia. So, yeah, the natural environment is, other than my family, is probably what I miss the most.
Julian Assange, thanks so much for taking the time to speak to us on Triple J's Hack program.
Most welcome.
Triple J Hack with Tom Tilley.
Julian Assange, the founder and editor-in-chief of WikiLeaks and the Victorian Senate candidate, almost getting a bit poetic there about his love of his country, Australia, and how much he misses the colour of the sky and the sound of the birds. A fascinating interview, lots of people texting in. Finally, a reason not just to draw rude pictures on my ballot paper, Arthur from Cogra. Another person says, I love this guy. Yes, Julian. Those who sacrifice freedom for a sense of security deserve neither. I'm 24 and don't vote for this reason. If Julian wins, I will vote. I guess it might be a bit late by then. Another person says, before people judge Julian about the rape allegations, they should read the police report and then make their own minds up. He made it available online. Is Australia ready for the truth? We weren't ready even for a female Prime Minister. Another person says, keep strong, Julian. Justice will prevail. So lots of interesting reactions there. A very split text line. A lot of people supporting Julian Assange. A lot of people also very cynical about what he's doing, whether he'll be able to get back into Australia and why he hasn't faced the allegations in Sweden.